There are moments in life that fracture everything that came before them. One second, the world is ordinary. Children are laughing. Teachers are calling attendance. A security guard is standing at his post, watching the familiar rhythm of another Thursday morning. And then, in the span of a heartbeat, everything changes. March 12th, 2026, West Bloomfield, Michigan. A quiet suburb northwest of Detroit, the kind of place where neighbors know each other by name, where synagogues and churches and mosques stand within miles of one another, where community still means something. And on this particular morning, at one of the most beloved Jewish institutions in the state, the unthinkable arrived. What happened at Temple Israel that day would shake not only a community, but an entire nation. And the question that would haunt investigators, journalists, and ordinary Americans alike was a simple one. How close did we come to losing everything? Temple Israel is not just a synagogue. For decades, it has been a living, breathing center of Jewish life in Metro Detroit, one of the largest and most vibrant Jewish communities in the United States. The congregation traces its roots back more than a century, built by immigrant families who came to Michigan with nothing but hope and determination. Over generations, it grew into something extraordinary, a place of worship, education, cultural celebration, and community service that welcomed thousands through its doors every year. By 2026, Temple Israel's campus in West Bloomfield had expanded to include not just a sanctuary for prayer, but a school, a place where children came each day to learn Hebrew, to study Jewish history and tradition, to connect with something larger than themselves. Parents dropped their kids off each morning trusting that they would be safe, that the routines of learning and laughter would unfold as they always had. On the morning of March 12th, 140 students and staff members arrived at the Temple Israel campus. It was a Thursday. Classes were in session. The parking lot filled up as it did every morning. Teachers prepared their lessons. Children took their seats. The security team logged in for their shift, monitoring the entrance as they had been trained to do. There was nothing, no warning, no threat called in, no visible sign, that suggested this day would be any different from the thousands of days before it. The sky over West Bloomfield was an ordinary Michigan winter sky. The kind of day where you pull your coat a little tighter and think about nothing more complicated than what's for lunch. The kind of day that feels completely, devastatingly safe. It happened fast. That is almost always how it happens. A truck appeared, not drifting, not swerving by accident, moving with intention, accelerating directly toward the synagogue building. The sound must have registered before the image did. The roar of an engine, the scream of tires, and then impact. The vehicle slammed into the structure. But this was not simply a crash. As investigators would later determine, the truck had been loaded with explosive mortar-style devices, weapons that were not purchased at a hardware store or assembled casually. This was planned. This was deliberate. And as the truck drove into the building, it caught fire, igniting a chain of destruction that sent smoke billowing into the cold Michigan morning air. What followed in those first seconds was chaos in its purest form. But the security team at Temple Israel did not freeze. They had been trained for exactly this kind of moment, trained to act when every instinct says to run. And so, as the truck burned and smoke began to fill the air, security personnel engaged the suspect. Gunfire was exchanged. The suspect was armed with a rifle. He had come prepared for a confrontation. What he had not anticipated, or perhaps what he had calculated and accepted, was the response he would meet. The firefight was brief, brutal, and decisive. One security guard was struck by the vehicle itself, hit in the chaos of the initial crash, his body absorbing the violence that had been aimed at the building behind him. He went down. Around him, smoke was thickening, alarms were sounding, and somewhere inside the building, 140 people were about to discover that their ordinary Thursday had just become something else entirely. The minutes after the attack were a blur of sirens, shouting, and smoke. Emergency responders flooded the campus. Police units converged from multiple directions. Fire crews battled the blaze that had erupted inside the building where the truck had come to rest. The acrid smell of burning metal and explosive residue hung over the scene. Inside the building, teachers made a decision that every educator prays they will never have to make. They moved fast, they moved quietly, and they kept the children together. The protocols that had been drilled, rehearsed, discussed in abstract terms during training sessions suddenly became the only thing standing between chaos and catastrophe. The security guard who had been struck by the truck was pulled to safety and attended to. He was alive, hurt, but alive. Approximately 30 officers who responded to the scene were treated for smoke inhalation, evidence of how rapidly the fire spread, how thick the smoke became, how dangerous the environment remained even after the immediate threat was neutralized. But the suspect, the man who had driven that truck into the building, who had come loaded with weapons and explosives and whatever dark purpose had brought him to this moment, was found dead inside the vehicle. A rifle recovered at the scene. The attack was over. The investigation was just beginning. Within hours, the Department of Homeland Security identified the man who had carried out the attack. His name was Ayman Mohammed Ghazali. He was 41 years old. The name meant nothing to most Americans. He had not appeared on watch lists in ways that had triggered intervention. He had not broadcast his intentions across social media in ways that had been caught and analyzed. He was, to all outward appearances, a man living a quiet life in Dearborn Heights, Michigan, a community with one of the largest Arab-American populations in the United States, a community that is, by the overwhelming measure of every metric available, peaceful, hardworking, and deeply American. But Ayman Ghazali had been carrying something that had been building for a long time. And on the morning of March 12, 2026, he had decided to act on it. Federal investigators began the painstaking work of reconstructing a life, of tracing backward from the moment of violence to understand everything that had led to it. Ayman Mohammed Ghazali was born in Lebanon in 1985. He grew up in a country that has known more than its share of war, a nation that spent 15 years consumed by civil conflict, that has been a battleground for regional powers for generations, that has watched its cities rebuilt and destroyed and rebuilt again. Lebanon is a country of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary suffering, and many of its people carry both. In 2009, Ghazali applied for a United States visa. He wanted what so many people want: a better life, a new start, the particular promise that America has always extended to those willing to seek it. His application was processed. He entered the United States legally in 2011, sponsored by his American wife. He built a life in Michigan. He put down roots. In 2016, 5 years after arriving, Ayman Mohammed Ghazali became a United States citizen. He had followed the process, taken the oath, pledged his allegiance to the country that had accepted him. He was, by every legal and official measure, an American. He lived in Dearborn Heights. Neighbors later described the familiar portrait: a man who kept to himself, who didn't draw attention, who seemed to be living the modest, unremarkable life of someone just trying to get by. Nobody, it seemed, knew what he was thinking. Nobody knew what was happening inside him. Nobody knew what he was planning. The question that investigators, journalists, and the public most urgently needed answered was the most ancient question in the aftermath of violence. Why? Why this place? Why this community? Why this day? The answer, as it began to take shape through sources close to the investigation, was one that connected a single act of violence in a Michigan suburb to one of the most dangerous and complex geopolitical situations in the modern world. According to information that emerged in the days following the attack, members of Ghazali's family had been killed in Lebanon. Killed, reportedly, in airstrikes connected to the broader conflict that had consumed the Middle East. A conflict involving the United States, Israel, and Iran, and the various proxy forces that operate in the spaces between them. To understand what may have driven Ayman Ghazali, you have to understand the world he was watching from Dearborn Heights, a world in which Lebanon had once again become a theater of war, a world in which Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed militant organization that maintains deep roots in Lebanese society, had been drawn into escalating confrontation with Israel. A world in which American involvement and American weapons were perceived by many in the region as directly responsible for civilian deaths. For a man who had family in Lebanon. For a man who may have received word, perhaps through a phone call, perhaps through social media, perhaps through the terrible grapevine of diaspora grief, that people he loved were gone. For a man who looked at a map of the world and saw a line drawn from Washington and Tel Aviv to the rubble where his family had been, What does that do to a person? What does grief, filtered through ideology, filtered through isolation, filtered through whatever particular darkness had settled over his life, ultimately produce? It can produce this. It produced this. The FBI was careful, as it always is, to note that the investigation was ongoing and that no final conclusions about motive had been drawn. But the direction was clear. This was not random. This was not the act of a man in the grip of private madness disconnected from the world around him. This was, in the assessment of federal law enforcement, an act of violence directed specifically at the Jewish community, fueled, at least in part, by the raging fires of a conflict thousands of miles away. Within hours of the attack, the full weight of federal law enforcement descended on West Bloomfield and on the broader investigation. The FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, agencies that have spent the last 2 decades building the architecture of counterterrorism response in the United States, all turned their attention to Temple, Israel. FBI officials were unambiguous in their public characterization of the attack. This was an act of violence directed at the Jewish community. Full stop. Not ambiguous. Not a matter of interpretation. A man had loaded a truck with explosive devices and driven it into a synagogue on a school day. The intent, whatever the precise contours of his ideology, was unmistakable. Federal agents began the deep forensic work, examining Ghazali's digital footprint, his communications, his financial records, his travels. They sought to determine whether he had acted alone, whether he had received assistance, whether there were others who had known and said nothing, whether the attack represented an isolated act of radicalized grief or something more organized and more dangerous. The community was left to grapple with questions that have no satisfying answers. How do you make sense of violence born from violence born from violence? How do you respond to the weaponization of grief? How do you protect against a threat that wears no uniform and carries no flag and lives until the moment it acts, like any other neighbor? These are not new questions. They are the questions that have defined the post-9/11 era. They are the questions that communities across America, Jewish communities, Muslim communities, communities of every kind that have faced targeted violence, have been asking for a generation. And they remain, stubbornly, unanswered. But here is what did not happen. Here is the number that matters most in the story of March 12, 2026. 0. Not one of the 140 students and staff members inside Temple Israel that morning was killed. In an attack that brought a burning truck loaded with explosive devices into a building full of children, in an attack that involved a gunfight on school grounds, not a single child died, not a single teacher, not a single administrator. This did not happen by accident. It did not happen by luck, though luck may have played its small role, as it always does in the space between catastrophe and survival. It happened because of decisions that had been made weeks and months before Ayman Ghazali ever pointed that truck toward the synagogue. 2 months before the attack, just 2 months, Temple Israel's security team had completed active shooter preparedness training with the FBI. They had run the drills. They had walked through the protocols. They had talked about what to do when the unthinkable arrives. And then, when it arrived, when the truck came through and the fire started and the gunshots rang out, they knew what to do. The security personnel who engaged the suspect almost certainly prevented a mass casualty event. That is not speculation. That is the assessment of people who have spent careers thinking about these scenarios, running these numbers, studying what happens when a prepared response meets a determined attacker. The exchange of fire, the decision to engage rather than retreat, stopped what could have been an unimaginable massacre. The security guard who was hit by the vehicle, who absorbed the physical violence of that moment with his own body, was hospitalized. He was expected to recover. His colleagues continued the response even as he went down. Because that is what training does. It doesn't make you fearless, but it gives you something to fall back on when fear arrives. It gives you a decision tree in a moment when the human mind wants to shut down completely. The injured guard's recovery would become, in the days that followed, a symbol of everything that had gone right in a situation designed to go catastrophically wrong. In the days and weeks after the attack, West Bloomfield did what communities have always done in the face of violence. It came together. Vigils were held. Flowers were placed. Elected officials stood before cameras and said the words that elected officials say in these moments, some of them meaning it more than others. Jewish organizations across the country issued statements of solidarity. Muslim community leaders in Dearborn, painfully aware that their community's name would be invoked in the coverage, painfully aware of what that could mean, were among the first to condemn the attack in unambiguous terms. Because violence against a Jewish community is not a statement that lands only on Jewish ears. It lands on everyone who has ever been targeted because of who they are. It lands on every community that has gathered in a house of worship and wondered, in some quiet corner of their consciousness, whether this is the day. It lands on every American who has looked at the country and seen, with increasing clarity, the forces that seek to divide us winning ground. The 140 people who walked out of Temple Israel alive on March 12, 2026, the children who went home to their parents, the teachers who sat in their cars afterward and shook, the security personnel who debriefed and then went home and tried to sleep. They carry this day now. It is in them. It will always be in them. The before and after of a moment that could have taken everything. There is a particular kind of grief that attaches itself to near misses. It is quieter than the grief of actual loss, and in some ways harder to articulate because the world wants you to be grateful, and you are deeply, completely grateful. But you also understand how thin the line was. You understand that the difference between a tragedy and a catastrophe was a security team that had gone through their paces 2 months earlier, was a guard who stood his ground, was a set of protocols that someone, somewhere, had insisted on implementing. What happened at Temple Israel on March 12, 2026 was, in the formal language of law enforcement, an act of terrorism. It was also, in the language of human experience, a story about what happens when communities invest in their own protection, when the abstract exercise of a drill becomes the concrete reality of survival. 140 people came home that night. 140. Children sat at dinner tables and told their parents something had happened at school. Parents held their children a little longer than usual. In homes across West Bloomfield and beyond, people said prayers of gratitude for something that was very nearly lost. The investigation continues. The geopolitical fires that may have sparked this attack continue to burn, thousands of miles away, in a region that has known war for so long that peace feels like a rumor. The questions of radicalization, of grief weaponized, of how violence abroad becomes violence at home. These questions will outlast this story. But tonight, in West Bloomfield, Michigan, 140 people are alive. And that fragile, hard-won, almost lost fact is where we find whatever it is that comes after fear. Not safety, not certainty, but resilience. The stubborn, quiet, human refusal to be erased. When the doors opened that morning, no one knew what was waiting. When they opened again at the end of the day, what walked through them was something that violence could not take. The living, the breathing, the still here,